The disappearance of Jennifer Hillier-Penney in St. Anthony has been well documented for a decade, but the real story of that night remains unclear 10 years later. After a lengthy investigation, Hillier-Penney's estranged husband was charged with first-degree murder in 2023. Now a month-long trial is laying out all the evidence for a jury to decide what happened the night of November 30th in 2016. NTV's Becky Daly has been following the trial and has the story.
Dean Penney's first-degree murder trial began last Wednesday after a jury was selected. That same day, the Crown delivered opening arguments alleging that Dean Penney arranged the death of his estranged wife and planned for her to be home alone that day. The defense, however, told the jury they intend to prove that someone else killed Jennifer Hillier-Penney, someone who is now deceased. Lawyer Mark Grushi told the jury they are going to hear from Dean Penney himself. He's going to take the stand in his own defense.
The first sign that something was terribly wrong was not the discovery of a body. It was the complete absence of one. On the morning of December 1, 2016, in the quiet town of St. Anthony, Newfoundland and Labrador, a mother of two simply vanished. There was no frantic goodbye. No packed suitcase. No message explaining where she had gone. Instead, investigators walked into a scene that felt frozen in time. Jennifer Hillier-Penney's purse was still there. Her cell phone had been left behind. Her wallet, identification, keys, shoes, and personal belongings remained exactly where they should have been. Even her vehicle had not moved. Everything that a person would normally take before leaving home had been abandoned. It was as if Jennifer had disappeared in the middle of an ordinary night, without ever intending to leave. For police, that detail changed everything. Adults sometimes choose to disappear. They leave behind difficult relationships, financial problems, or personal struggles. But Jennifer's circumstances painted the opposite picture. She was preparing for a new beginning. She had accepted a new job. She was looking ahead to the next chapter of her life. Those who knew her could not imagine a world where she would willingly leave her daughters without a single word. As hours turned into days, fear quietly settled over the small coastal community. Search teams combed forests where dense evergreens swallowed sunlight. Volunteers searched rugged shorelines battered by the icy Atlantic Ocean. Helicopters scanned terrain stretching for miles, while boats examined surrounding waters. Every passing day deepened the same haunting realization. Jennifer was nowhere. The silence became louder than any crime scene. Without a body, investigators had no obvious cause of death. Without eyewitnesses, they had no clear timeline. Without physical evidence pointing to exactly what had happened, they were left with one overwhelming question. How does someone disappear so completely? As police reconstructed Jennifer's final known hours, one detail immediately stood above all others. The last confirmed place she had been. The last person known to have seen her alive. The home she had once shared with the man she was trying to leave behind. That single fact would cast a shadow over the investigation for years. At first, there were no dramatic arrests. No televised confessions. No hidden surveillance footage revealing the truth. Only a family trapped between hope and heartbreak, refusing to believe that Jennifer had simply walked away from the people she loved most. Meanwhile, investigators quietly began piecing together the fragments of a life that had suddenly stopped. Every receipt. Every phone record. Every vehicle movement. Every statement. Every inconsistency. Because somewhere inside those ordinary details, they believed, was the story of Jennifer's final night. And although no one knew it yet, this missing person investigation was slowly transforming into one of the most complex murder cases in Newfoundland and Labrador's history. A case that would challenge investigators for nearly a decade before a jury would finally hear what prosecutors believed had happened behind closed doors on that cold November night. Jennifer's body has never been found. Yet years later, someone would stand trial for her murder. How do prosecutors convince 12 jurors that a murder occurred when the victim has never been recovered? That question would become the heart of a case that continues to fascinate investigators, lawyers, and true crime followers alike. Jennifer Hillier-Penney was known as the kind of person who made life easier for everyone around her. Friends and family remembered a woman whose warmth filled every room she entered. She was compassionate, dependable, and deeply devoted to the people she loved. Above all else, she was a mother who placed her daughters at the center of her world. She had built a life in the small town of St. Anthony, a close-knit fishing community perched along the northern coast of Newfoundland and Labrador. It was the type of place where people greeted one another by name, where families knew each other's histories, and where news traveled quickly. The rugged coastline was breathtaking, but it was also isolated. In a town where everyone knew everyone, private struggles often remained hidden behind closed doors. To those on the outside, Jennifer's life appeared ordinary. She worked hard, cared for her family, and carried herself with quiet strength. But beneath that calm exterior, her marriage was slowly unraveling. Jennifer and Dean Penney had spent years building a life together, raising their children and sharing a home. Like many relationships, theirs had experienced challenges, but by 2016 those challenges had become impossible to ignore. The marriage had reached a breaking point. Jennifer made a decision that would change everything. She wanted a divorce. It was not an impulsive choice. According to evidence later presented in court, Jennifer had begun taking practical steps toward creating an independent future. She had secured new employment that would allow her to live closer to one of her daughters. She was preparing for a fresh start, one built on stability, independence, and hope. She also began organizing her finances. Investigators would later reveal that only weeks before her disappearance, Jennifer had updated important personal records, including removing Dean Penney as the beneficiary of her life insurance policy. On its own, such a decision was entirely lawful and not unusual during a separation. But in hindsight, prosecutors argued it became one piece of a much larger picture. To Jennifer, these were the careful preparations of someone beginning a new chapter. To investigators, they would later represent a timeline that was impossible to ignore. Family members described Jennifer as excited about what lay ahead. While ending a marriage is rarely easy, those closest to her believed she remained optimistic. She was looking toward the future rather than dwelling on the past. Yet relationships ending after many years can create emotions that are difficult to predict. Court proceedings later revealed that the separation had become increasingly strained. Financial matters, shared responsibilities, and the reality of permanent separation placed enormous pressure on the family. Prosecutors argued that these mounting tensions formed the backdrop to what would soon unfold. Still, life continued. Jennifer focused on her daughters. She continued making plans. She continued preparing for the future she believed was finally within reach. Then came the evening of November 30, 2016. Jennifer went to the home where Dean Penney was living. According to the evidence presented at trial, she intended to stay there with their youngest daughter. No one could have known that this routine family arrangement would become the final confirmed chapter of Jennifer's life. There were no reports of a public confrontation. No emergency calls. No neighbors describing screams in the night. Nothing that immediately suggested unimaginable violence was about to occur. By all outward appearances, it was simply another evening. But investigators would later believe that sometime during that night, everything changed. When the sun rose over the rocky coastline the following morning, Jennifer was gone. Not gone in the sense of someone choosing to leave. Gone in a way that left behind only questions. Questions that would haunt her family for years. Questions that investigators would dedicate thousands of hours trying to answer. And questions that would eventually lead police to believe the greatest clue had never been hidden at all. It had been sitting in plain sight from the very beginning. The last place Jennifer was ever known to be. As investigators worked backward through Jennifer Hillier-Penney's final days, they quickly realized that understanding her disappearance meant understanding the months leading up to it. Crimes of this nature rarely erupt without warning. More often, they are preceded by a series of choices, conflicts, and quiet moments that only make sense when viewed in hindsight. To those closest to Jennifer, the signs of change had been impossible to miss. She had made the difficult decision to end her marriage and was determined to build a new life. It was not a decision she had taken lightly. Years of shared history, children, and responsibilities made the separation emotionally and practically complex. But despite the uncertainty that comes with starting over, Jennifer appeared committed to moving forward. She was making plans instead of excuses. She had accepted a new job. She was preparing for a different future. According to evidence later presented in court, she was also taking steps to separate her finances from her estranged husband. Among those changes was updating her life insurance policy and removing Dean Penney as the beneficiary just weeks before her disappearance. Standing alone, the decision was neither suspicious nor unusual. People going through divorce frequently make similar changes. Yet prosecutors would later argue that, placed alongside everything else, it became one more piece of a troubling timeline. Friends and relatives would later describe Jennifer as someone looking ahead rather than looking back. She was focused on her daughters and eager to regain stability. There was no indication that she intended to disappear. If anything, every decision she made pointed toward someone investing in the future. That simple fact would become one of the strongest foundations of the Crown's case. Because people preparing for a new chapter rarely abandon it without explanation. Investigators also examined the state of the separation itself. The end of a long marriage often brings difficult conversations about finances, property, parenting arrangements, and the emotional reality of letting go. Court proceedings later painted a picture of a relationship under significant strain as the couple navigated those challenges. Exactly what was said behind closed doors during those final weeks remains unknown. No independent witness could describe every private conversation. No recording captured the emotions inside the home. Any conclusions about those moments remain limited to the evidence presented in court rather than certainty. What investigators could establish, however, was Jennifer's final confirmed movement. On the evening of November 30, 2016, she arrived at the residence where Dean Penney was living so she could stay with their youngest daughter. It was a familiar arrangement, one that gave no outward indication it would become the final confirmed sighting of Jennifer alive. As the night passed, the outside world remained unaware that anything was wrong. Neighbors reported nothing extraordinary. There were no emergency calls. No obvious disturbance drew immediate attention. By sunrise, the quiet routine of a small Newfoundland town continued as it always had. Only later would investigators conclude that whatever happened to Jennifer likely occurred during those unseen hours, hidden behind the walls of a home where no independent witness could tell the story. The absence of noise became one of the case's most haunting features. Violence, prosecutors argued years later, does not always announce itself. Sometimes it leaves behind only silence. And in Jennifer's case, that silence was almost perfect. When she failed to appear the next morning, concern spread quickly. Her personal belongings had not moved. Her vehicle remained where it had been left. The ordinary items that anchored her daily life were still waiting for someone who never returned. It was as though Jennifer herself had vanished while everything else stayed exactly where it belonged. For investigators, that was a powerful contradiction. A woman planning a fresh start does not normally leave behind the very tools needed to live that new life. The more detectives reconstructed Jennifer's final known movements, the narrower their timeline became. Somewhere between the evening she arrived and the morning she was reported missing, the answers had disappeared with her. What police did not yet know was that solving this mystery would require years of painstaking investigation, thousands of investigative hours, and one of the largest undercover operations ever undertaken by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Newfoundland and Labrador. The truth, investigators believed, had been carefully concealed. The challenge was proving it without the one piece of evidence every homicide detective hopes to find: Jennifer herself. The investigation began with hope. During the first few days after Jennifer Hillier-Penney disappeared, detectives pursued every possibility. They knew that adults sometimes vanished voluntarily. Some left to escape difficult relationships. Others walked away from overwhelming personal struggles. Until the evidence proved otherwise, investigators had a duty to consider every scenario. But Jennifer's case refused to fit any of them. Nothing about her life suggested she intended to disappear. She had made plans for work. She remained devoted to her daughters. Her vehicle had been left behind. Her cell phone had not traveled with her. Her purse, identification, bank cards, and other personal belongings were exactly where they should have been. The evidence pointed in one direction. Jennifer had not prepared to leave. As the realization settled in, the search expanded dramatically. RCMP officers, local police, search and rescue teams, volunteers, helicopters, boats, and specially trained search dogs combed the rugged landscape surrounding St. Anthony. Dense forests were searched meter by meter. Rocky shorelines were examined despite bitter coastal winds. Nearby waters were scanned repeatedly, each tide carrying both hope and heartbreak. Every search ended the same way. No sign of Jennifer. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The questions only multiplied. Investigators collected surveillance footage, examined phone records, analyzed financial activity, and interviewed family members, friends, neighbors, co-workers, and anyone who might have crossed Jennifer's path during her final days. They reconstructed timelines down to the smallest detail. Who had seen her? When was she last confirmed alive? What happened after that? Every answer seemed to lead back to the same place. The house where Jennifer had spent her final known night. As detectives continued their work, they also scrutinized the statements given throughout the investigation. Like any major missing person case, investigators compared interviews against physical evidence, timelines, and digital records, looking for inconsistencies or details that required further examination. The investigation grew steadily larger. Years passed without an arrest. For Jennifer's family, every birthday, every Christmas, and every milestone became another painful reminder that there were still no answers. They lived with a cruel uncertainty that many families describe as one of the hardest forms of grief, mourning someone whose fate had never been fully confirmed. But while public attention slowly faded, the investigation never stopped. Behind the scenes, RCMP officers continued gathering evidence piece by piece. They reviewed old leads, followed new ones, and revisited information that earlier searches could not fully explain. Eventually, investigators made a decision that revealed just how seriously they viewed the case. They launched a covert, Mr. Big operation. The technique, used in some Canadian investigations, is among the most resource-intensive undercover strategies available to law enforcement. It involves undercover officers gradually building a relationship with a suspect over an extended period, creating the illusion of a powerful criminal organization in hopes of obtaining reliable admissions or new evidence. The method is controversial and subject to strict legal scrutiny because courts closely examine whether any statements obtained are voluntary and reliable. In Jennifer's case, the operation became enormous. According to investigators, roughly 100 RCMP officers participated over many months. It was one of the largest undercover operations ever conducted in Newfoundland and Labrador. The public knew almost nothing about it. While life continued in St. Anthony, undercover officers were quietly carrying out an investigation unlike anything the community had ever seen. Every meeting was carefully planned. Every interaction was documented. Every detail mattered. Detectives believed the truth had survived somewhere beneath years of silence. They simply needed the evidence to prove it. Then, after nearly 7 years of unanswered questions, the investigation reached a turning point. In December 2023, RCMP officers arrested Dean Penney and charged him with first-degree murder in Jennifer Hillier-Penney's disappearance. The announcement sent shockwaves through Newfoundland and Labrador. For Jennifer's loved ones, it marked the first major step toward accountability. For prosecutors, however, the hardest part was only beginning. They were preparing to try a murder case without the one piece of evidence that is so often central to proving a homicide. Jennifer's body had never been found. The courtroom would soon become the place where years of circumstantial evidence, forensic analysis, witness testimony, and undercover investigative work would be tested before 12 jurors asked to answer the most difficult question of all. Had the Crown proven, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Jennifer Hillier-Penney had been murdered? The courtroom was filled with something that had lingered over this case since the very beginning. Absence. There was no murder weapon displayed before the jury. No forensic reconstruction of a crime scene stained with unmistakable evidence. No medical examiner explaining the cause of death. Most haunting of all, there was no body. Jennifer Hillier-Penney had disappeared years earlier, and despite countless searches, investigators had never found her remains. Yet prosecutors stood before 12 jurors and argued that the evidence, when viewed as a whole, pointed to only one reasonable conclusion. Jennifer had been murdered. The Crown's case was built piece by piece, not around a single dramatic revelation, but around a chain of evidence that prosecutors said formed a complete picture. Jurors heard about Jennifer's plans for the future. She had accepted a new job. She was preparing for life after her separation. She remained devoted to her daughters. There was no indication that she intended to abandon the life she was carefully rebuilding. Investigators testified that after the night of November 30, 2016, Jennifer simply ceased to exist in every traceable way. Her phone was never used again. Her financial activity stopped. There were no confirmed sightings that investigators considered credible. The ordinary routines that define a person's daily life ended abruptly. For prosecutors, that silence spoke volumes. The Crown also presented evidence surrounding the deteriorating marriage and Jennifer's efforts to become financially independent. Among the facts presented at trial was that she had removed Dean Penney as the beneficiary of her life insurance policy shortly before her disappearance. Prosecutors argued that this, together with other evidence, helped establish the broader context of the relationship. On its own, however, it was not presented as proof of guilt. The trial also examined the extensive undercover, Mr. Big, operation conducted by the RCMP. Jurors learned how undercover officers spent months building a carefully controlled fictional criminal organization, gradually developing a relationship designed to test whether new evidence or admissions might emerge. Because this investigative technique has been the subject of legal scrutiny in Canada, the court carefully considered whether the evidence obtained through the operation met the standards required for fairness and reliability. Every aspect of the investigation came under intense examination. The defense challenged the Crown's interpretation of the evidence. Without a body, they argued, critical questions remained unanswered. No one could determine exactly how Jennifer died. No one could establish precisely when she died. No one could identify the exact location where the killing allegedly occurred. The jury was reminded that the burden of proof rested entirely with the prosecution. Suspicion alone was not enough. Circumstantial evidence, no matter how compelling, had to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. For weeks, witnesses took the stand. Investigators described years of painstaking work. Experts explained how timelines have been reconstructed from countless pieces of information. Family members recounted the devastating impact of Jennifer's disappearance and the certainty they felt that she would never have willingly abandoned her children. Each day added another layer to a case unlike almost any other. The jury was not being asked to decide whether Jennifer was missing. That fact had never been disputed. They were being asked to determine whether the evidence proved she had been intentionally killed, and if so, whether Dean Penney was responsible. It was an extraordinary legal challenge. History has shown that no-body homicide prosecutions are among the most difficult cases for any prosecutor to prove. Without the victim's remains, every remaining piece of evidence must carry even greater weight. The courtroom grew quieter as closing arguments approached. Years of investigation. Thousands of hours of police work. One of the largest undercover operations in the province's history. All of it now rested in the hands of 12 ordinary citizens. They would soon retire to deliberate. And when they returned, their decision would forever change the course of Jennifer Hillier-Penney's story. The wait for a verdict was agonizing. For Jennifer Hillier-Penney's family, it represented the culmination of nearly a decade spent living in uncertainty. Every holiday, every birthday, every family milestone had carried the same painful reminder that Jennifer was missing. They had endured years of searches, countless interviews, and endless questions, all while holding on to the hope that one day they would learn the truth. Now, that truth rested in the hands of a jury. After carefully considering weeks of testimony and the evidence presented during the trial, the jurors reached their decision. In May 2026, Dean Penney was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Jennifer Hillier-Penney. The verdict marked a historic moment in one of Newfoundland and Labrador's most significant criminal investigations. Despite the absence of Jennifer's remains, the jury concluded that the Crown had proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. For Jennifer's loved ones, the decision brought a measure of justice, but not closure. A conviction cannot replace a daughter. It cannot comfort children who grew up without their mother. It cannot answer every question that has lingered since that cold November night in 2016. Under Canadian law, a conviction for first-degree murder carries a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment with no eligibility for parole for 25 years. That sentence reflected the jury's conclusion that Jennifer's killing was intentional and met the legal threshold for first-degree murder. As the legal proceedings came to an end, one heartbreaking fact remained unchanged. Jennifer had still not been found. Her family spoke openly about the pain of living without knowing where she rests. While the guilty verdict acknowledged what they had believed for years, it could not give them the opportunity to lay Jennifer to rest or visit a gravesite. The search for her remains continued to hold profound importance. The case also left a lasting impact on the community of St. Anthony. Residents who had once joined search efforts and shared posters now reflected on how a seemingly ordinary disappearance had concealed a devastating crime. In a town where neighbors knew one another by name, the tragedy served as a reminder that unimaginable violence can occur even in the quietest places. For investigators, the conviction was the result of years of persistence. The RCMP's painstaking work, including one of the province's largest undercover, Mr. Big operations, demonstrated the determination required to solve a homicide without a body. It became a case studied for its investigative complexity and the challenges of proving murder through circumstantial evidence. Yet even with the legal process complete, the story remains unfinished. Somewhere, Jennifer's remains have never been recovered. Somewhere, the final physical chapter of her life is still missing. For her family, that absence is a wound that no courtroom verdict can fully heal. Jennifer Hillier-Penney is remembered not for the way her life ended, but for the life she was building, a devoted mother, a caring daughter, a trusted friend, and a woman who was looking forward to a new beginning. Instead, that future was stolen. Her story stands as a reminder that justice and closure are not always the same thing. A courtroom can determine guilt, but it cannot erase grief or restore the years that were taken from those left behind. As long as Jennifer's remains remain undiscovered, one chapter of this case will always be unwritten. Perhaps the greatest act of justice still waiting to happen is bringing her home. If this case has stayed with you, consider what it reveals about resilience, investigation, and the enduring strength of a family that refused to stop seeking answers. Do you believe a family can ever truly find closure without recovering their loved one's remains? If you found this documentary thoughtful and respectful, please like this video, share it with others, subscribe to Crime Vault, and turn on notifications so you never miss another true crime story. Your support helps keep these victim stories alive and remembered.